Session prep. I think it's what's most intimidating as starting as a new DM. It's what turned me off from DMing for quite a while, and it's what I still think is probably the hardest part of being a Dungeon Master. But it doesn't need to be hard, and it doesn't need to feel hard. Even though I occasionally still get wrapped up in preparing for a session, or I get nervous that what I'm doing isn't going to be enough, I'm hoping I can help you overcome that fear and become a better DM because of it. To do that, I'm going to be prepping a session with you today. I'm not going to be drawing out the dungeons or planning exactly what monsters are going to go where, but I'm going to plan the abstract sense of the session that I will then later go in and fill in like the dungeons and what exact enemies I'm going to be using. If you'd like to see that video where I fill in the dungeons and the monsters, like a prepping combat video, I think that could deserve its own video, and maybe I'll do that later on if you guys want to see that. But for session prepping, I typically like to keep it broad because I think that if I put too many details into a session prep, then it's going to overwhelm me and cause me to railroad the players. So I like to keep things very abstract. So if you're my friend and your name is Joe, don't watch this video because this session is the one that I'm going to be running for you later this week. I've already talked to my friend Joe, and we have decided that he's going to be playing a character in a mercenary group. That part of session prep I find to be a little more collaborative, so I obviously wasn't going to record that. But the way you can do that with your players is you just kind of go up to them and talk to them. You talk and see what kind of game they're looking to run. This is obviously for session 1. For the later sessions, you skip these first initial steps. But I talked to my one player, because I'm playing one-on-one D&D. I talked to Joe, and we discussed, and he decided that he's going to play as a mercenary warlock. If you have a larger group, maybe you want to survey the group, see what kind of thing they're looking for, see if they're looking for more role-play focused, or more combat focused, or more politics focused, or theater of the mind combat, or on the grid combat. It really depends on the people that you're playing with, and all that part is very driven by the actual people who are going to be playing. Because if you don't talk to them before prepping the session, then the session isn't going to be fun for anyone when it eventually comes around, because they're going to have had no input. I mean, unless you actually know your friends that well where you think you can prep a session for them and surprise them with it. But for most people, I would avoid doing that even if you do think you know your friends, because it's always better to ask first. So now that I have the idea that Joe's going to be a mercenary warlock, I have something to base it on. So you're going to want a hook and a overarching adventure kind of thought out. I'm not saying to plan out like step by step what's going to happen on the overarching adventure, but you definitely want some key bullet points. So for this adventure, the key bullet points that I'm doing are: he is a mercenary. He works for a mercenary company. He's not a solo mercenary. And they are hired by a duke who is currently in a war with another duke over land and territory. So it's a pretty simple adventure because I'm using it to set up later adventures with a group D&D session, but it's still something, and it's still a couple bullet points to go off of. So what we can do is now expand on those and see how we can develop something like a hook or a intro session to help Joe get into this world. What I would do next is plan the session almost from the back. The back's usually where I start because it has the more meatier things, or maybe even like in the middle, I guess, because I'm trying to plan the big event that's going to happen that session. I find that if I start with the first event and then work forwards, I often don't know where it's going. So I think of one cool event and then I try to work backwards and forwards from there and like plan around that rather than starting from the front and going forwards. I think the cool event that I'm going to be doing for this first session is going to be a raid on a town. So I think that my player is going to be a small part of a raid that's happening on a town. He'll probably be responsible for taking out 1 or 2 connected buildings, and that'll be his job. So we got to plan around that. How do we get there? We're going to have to get some intel on this town prior to that. So maybe there can be a event that leads him to getting intel. So maybe like he is sneaking around a tavern or in like an enemy stronghold and listening in. I think I'm going to go with the tavern idea because I think that the people that he's going to be fighting aren't actually the enemy duke's men, but are rather going to be peasants, like a peasant revolt almost, that is unhappy about the new duke coming in and occupying their territory. So I think we'll have my player go to a tavern and gather some information, but we're gonna have to get him to that tavern somehow. So I would plan backwards again and get to the idea that maybe there was a peasant revolt or some sort of like peasant mob that attacked him and his group. And you may not think that this is a lot of stuff, and that's the point. It's not a lot of stuff, but players chew through content way slower than you could ever imagine. If you're a first-time DM, you are going to over-prepare most likely. I typically prepare 5 events. I would consider an event something like a 5-room dungeon, a major combat, an intrigue, a major conversation, almost like a negotiation, or anything like that. I consider that an event because that is something that's going to take a player 30 minutes or more to do. A 5-room dungeon, a combat, a negotiation, an intrigue. All those things take more than 30 minutes to do, and therefore I consider them an event because if you can plan 5 of those events, then you have 2.5 hours, and that's 2.5 hours if they don't do anything else, if they don't derail themselves somehow and go investigate dead ends or things like that. And that's only if each event takes 30 minutes, which events like a 5-room dungeon are going to take longer than 30 minutes, and maybe an event like investigating a tavern might take less. But you can almost never predict how long things are going to take because oftentimes players will end up doing something that you just don't expect. They'll end up deciding that they want to go off into the woods, and then half the session becomes them just hanging out in the woods trying to talk to animals for some reason. So it's almost hard to under-prepare because as long as you have a couple events, you can always direct them towards those events, and they will take them enough time, especially if you have multiple players, that a whole session can be eaten up by just 2 of them. So if you plan 5 of them prior to the start of the campaign, then that's probably enough for 2 or 3 sessions. But, you know, if your players are fast for some reason, it would work for just 1 or maybe 2 sessions. So that's why I like to start with 5 events. Every time I get close to running out of my 5 events, I plan another 5 events. And to get ideas for these kind of things, you want to look to inspiration. Like, you want to try to find inspiration in things such as books or movies you've watched. So for this campaign, I'm actually taking inspiration from The Black Company because they're a mercenary group. Now, you may get your inspiration from somewhere else. Like, you may be watching Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or reading The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, or reading Dune, or any adventure story that you can draw inspiration from. It doesn't just have to be fantasy. It can be really anything. I've lifted plots from South Park and tried to put them into D&D, and it's worked to some sort of level. I'm not going to say that that was the smartest move of me, because South Park isn't really an adventure, but something like Star Trek or Star Wars or anything like that, where it's like people going on an adventure, then that can work. Obviously, you're going to want to change the flavor to match the setting that you're trying to run, but, you know, the general plot can often be applied to any time period. It's just the coat of paint that you put on top of it and some core mechanics that you change around of how things function. So going back to the adventure that I've been prepping, the peasant mob, I'm kind of getting some vibes that are similar from the start of the Black Company, where they have that fort and there is some people trying to attack them in the very beginning of the book. So I'm going to change that around a little bit, but kind of draw inspiration from that and have it so that there are a group of peasants who break into the mercenary group's like stronghold that they've established in this city, and it's going to be a combat. Now, I'm not going to prep the actual combat. I'm not going to say how many. Obviously, I'm thinking only a couple people breaking in because this is a one-on-one D&D session, but I'm not going to get into the specifics of that right now because prepping the actual session and prepping the combat are a bit different. And while I often do them at the same time, I think that prepping the combat is going to get its own video, and I don't want to have to make this video too long. So I think that there's going to be a peasant mob that breaks into the fort that they're in. They're going to get into a combat, and one of the peasants will be captured somehow. I think then the peasants will be interrogated by my player. If not, I will have one of the NPCs give a little bit of an interrogation, and my player will eventually get the information from one source or another that the peasants were organizing in this tavern, and that is where they all got together to plan this rebellion type thing. So that will draw my player over to the tavern. He'll do a bit of investigation. I don't know if he'll do investigation. Maybe he'll go in there and start attacking people, but he will go there to get information about what's going on. And from there, he will learn of how the peasants are planning their rebellion and how they're planning to attack the stronghold that they are fortifying and how they plan on removing these mercenaries from the city. So then from that information, I'll have my player basically just get into prepping for a full-scale siege of the city. And then in that, I'll draw him towards one of 2 dungeons that I have prepared. I'm calling them dungeons because they're going to be areas of rooms that just have different peasants in them. So they're like the monsters in the dungeon, and there'll be some loot and stuff like that for him to take. So even though I'm not building a conventional dungeon, it's still falling under that rhetoric of a dungeon. So I'll have him directed towards that by this rebellion he's prepping. I'll have one of the other officers in the mercenary company ask him, hey, do you want to go to this building or one of these other buildings? Because, like, what do you think would be the best strategy? And then my player will pick one of the buildings to go to, and that will be a dungeon. So right there, that's 3 events. And then I think personally that will be enough for a session, but I like to prep 2 extra just in case that he gets through there. So I got to think, like, what could be the fallout of this? Obviously, there could be some stragglers, some peasants left behind that are still rebelling, or maybe the enemy Duke's men come in, or even the friendly Duke's men come in, and some sort of either diplomacy or combat happens depending on that. So I think I'm going to go with there are some straggler peasants left, and then I think the Duke's guards will come in so that we can tie this back to the fact that he is a mercenary working for a Duke rather than an actual soldier in the Duke's army. So I think I'd rather do it in the order of Duke's men and then straggler peasants, because I think I want the Duke's men to be more of a like negotiation, talking encounter. And I don't think we've had enough of those, like, because the tavern encounter can very easily be turned into a combat encounter, even though I'm planning the idea of it being an intrigue encounter. But the Duke's men encounter really can't be turned into a combat encounter unless he wants to derail the entire mercenary company, which is probably out of the scope of this video and isn't something I'd really prepare for. So that's going to be more of a diplomacy encounter rather than one that is focused around fighting. And so I'm going to put that right after the major fight, and then I'll have some straggler peasants that are left. I'll probably have one of the officers in the mercenary company say, hey, there's some peasants that are still left around here. You got to go finish them off, go get rid of them, and that will be a combat encounter of its own. So I understand that that might not seem like a lot of prep for a session, and I kind of only did it in maybe 10-15 minutes. But that is really the core of what's happening when I'm prepping a session. Obviously, after this video, I'm going to go write all that down so that I don't forget it, because I don't have like a perfect memory. So I got to make sure I have everything written down. And from there, I'll flesh out a couple more details, like what the peasants in the tavern are going to say and what the combat encounters are going to look like and things like that. But I don't think I would prep much more than that. I think I might prep a little bit about what the mercenary company is like. I might plan that out a bit, like some notable NPCs that he may interact with, so that I kind of understand how they'll play. But a lot of my prepping the session is just a couple bullet points. And from those bullet points, I typically just kind of wing it almost. So I know that might seem like a weird way to go about doing things, but I often find that if I'm winging it, especially for the first session, I get more of a feel of what the NPCs are going to be like when I start role-playing them, rather than by like writing down personality traits or by prepping combat encounters with them. Maybe I'll write about a page of session prep. I'll write notable NPCs, the 5 bullet points of major events that I think are going to happen in the session. I will write maybe 3 sub points for each of those major events, like specifying the types of things that the players might ask questions about, such as what they'll find in the tavern, or maybe like how hard I want the combat encounters to be, or the style and like more in depth about the dungeon, or what the Duke's men will say to him. And those kind of things I'll prep a little bit more about, but I do often just wing it. And I think you can just wing it as well. I think if you have about a page of like prep for a session, that is enough. That's enough prep. I think that if you spend time prepping, if you spend time thinking about it, that's all you really have to do. Because as long as you've thought about it slightly beforehand, then you are ready to play D&D. Because if you sit there and you start thinking about how you're going to do this for way too long, I often find that you can start over-preparing and never actually get to playing the game. I fell into that trap a couple years ago where I was prepping a adventure, and I got caught up in building the entire world and every NPC they could interact with, the entire town, the entire story arc, everything that was going to happen in the adventure. And it took so long to prep the adventure that by the time it became time to play the game, I wasn't actually enjoying the adventure anymore. I was already over it. Like, I had exhausted myself of that world and of that adventure. So I think if you focus mainly on the 5 big points that your players are going to hit in the next session, then I think you're doing just enough to get ready and play. And as you start winging it more and more, you're going to get better at doing that, and you'll get more of a feel of the world you're playing in as you wing it in a specific world more often, and you'll get a better feel of how to just wing it in any D&D campaign. I know this video is all starting to sound like me just telling you to wing it at every possible moment, and I kind of am, but I'm not just saying that because I think that it is simpler and a easy way to get people to start DMing right away, and I secretly prep out my adventures all the way and like have a super like complicated roadmap. I'm telling you to do it that way because I do it that way. Obviously, for some people, I think that they would combust if they didn't have any session prep notes. But me personally, I think that being open to just, going with the flow and winging it is kind of a very important part of being a DM. Because being a DM often involves watching the players sit there and debate for about 45 minutes on where they should go next, and then going somewhere that you have no clue about. Someplace that you didn't even really think about. You wrote it on the map once because you were trying to think of a town nearby's name, and you were like, okay, I'm going to put that there just so that the world seems a little more real. And then your friends end up walking all the way over there because they misinterpreted a clue that you gave them through an NPC, or they just decided they want to do it. So I find that if you're not already winging it, you're going to end up doing that anyway. And so preparing to be winging it is a way to set yourself up so that when you end up having to do it anyway, you don't feel like you're just like being blindsided and getting hit from out of nowhere. You are already ready to be doing whatever because you didn't really prep that much. You didn't have like everything prepped out to a T. So people not doing what you thought was going to happen isn't that big of a deal. And you can actually just move what you thought was going to happen next if you don't have it overly prepped out. Because if you have things overly prepped out, it's harder to move the actual physical location of encounters because maybe they reference each other or there's like a pattern happening. But if you are just winging it from the beginning, you could take that encounter that was supposed to be at point A and move it over to point B. Like, we could take the tavern encounter and move it to a different town for some reason. If my friend decides that for some reason something is telling him he has to go over to a different tavern in a different town. About 50% of being a DM is winging it. So if you are preparing to wing it, then you're preparing to succeed, is the way I view it. So if you feel the need to write out endless session notes, then go ahead, be my guest. I think eventually you will learn that having minimalistic session notes will set you up for success. But if you feel like writing endless session notes, then go ahead. I think that some people need to do that, and I think that it helps some people run a better game. But for me personally, I find that it doesn't help me run a better game. It actually constrains the way I'm thinking and prevents me from being flexible when my players need me to be flexible. I think that's really all I have for you today, folks. I think the main takeaway of this video should be always remain flexible, always be ready to improvise when your players go off the rails, and just do some minimalistic session prep. 5 big events, a 5-room dungeon, a combat encounter, a diplomacy thing, an intrigue, or really anything that you think is going to take your players longer than 30 minutes. I consider that one of the 5 events, and you just prep out 5 of those, and I think you'll have a solid first session. And when you start getting to the end of those 5 major events, just prep out 5 more. So sometimes you'll have 7 events, sometimes you'll have 2 events, but just try to keep it near 5 events at all times so that you are always prepared for some reason your players start breezing through all the events. But that's really it, folks. I hope you have a fun time playing your sessions soon. I hope you have a great day, week, month, and year. I'll catch you in the next video.